Good afternoon. Welcome to the Paul Sawyer Public Library. My name is Diane Dehoney. I am the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer, and I just want to welcome you out. Thank you so much for joining us on what's turning out to be a pretty lovely day. I know there's a lot going on today, so we're very glad that you've chosen to spend the afternoon with us. Unfortunately, John Carlton, my co-organizer, was unable to be with us today. He's feeling a little under the weather, so send him some get well wishes, and he'll be back with us next time. So you're stuck with me today. But it is my great honor to be here with you today. This is our third lecture of the spring 2026 season, and today we are really happy to welcome Dr. Chuck Welsko to talk about Kentucky's governors. He'll be discussing Kentucky's governors up to the Civil War era, and unpacking the role of their role in Kentucky's first century. Just a little bit more about Chuck. Chuck Welsko is a historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. He received his Ph.D. from West Virginia University and has worked for Ford's Theater Society and the National Park Service at Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania National Military Park, the University of West Georgia, and is also the editor of the War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition at the Kentucky Historical Society. He is interested in the history of loyalty, citizenship, and identity in the contested border spaces of mid-19th century. His current book project is Breaking and Remaking the Mason-Dixon Line, Loyalty in Civil War America, 1850 through 1900. He is also working on multiple projects connected to Kentucky Governor Thomas E. Bramlett and two of the men he enslaved, Leander Pickens and Adam Duvall. Please help me to welcome to the podium today, Dr. Chuck Welsko.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. I realize I stand between you and really gorgeous weather, so thank you for being here today. I guess if it had been snowing or colder, we all might have been slightly more miserable, but less worried about all the nice weather. When I used to teach classes at West Virginia or West Georgia, this would always be the time when students would ask if we could go outside and have class outside. I don't think we can do that because of the PowerPoint, and the TV camera here would probably not be happy to move outside, but I thank you all for being here. It's nice to see many familiar faces and to see some new ones. I've got a talk that is a bit sprawling. I think the description I was listening to of I did submit that several months ago, and the title are a good sort of indication of that's right, I had to submit this back in December when I hadn't written this talk and was going to figure out what I was going to talk about. So we can talk at the end if the title actually matches what I talk about, and I've managed to knock my water over already. We're off to a good start. I haven't broken anything, so that's good. What I want to do first, as Diane said, I am the editor of the Civil War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition. If you haven't heard about this project, it is a project that I run at the Kentucky Historical Society with several really excellent staff. We have over 10,000 documents that are written to Kentucky's Civil War governors. This is a small plug for this project. Yes, it is a shameless plug. There's also going to be a quiz later. I'm not going to mention how many Civil War governors of Kentucky there are, and none of my staff are here, so I hope no one is going to shout it out and ruin the quiz. But I show this off to highlight the fact that I spend a lot of my days thinking about Kentucky's governors. I specifically think of the ones tied to, I had to redact the number from my head because I almost rolled immediately into spoiling the quiz from later. But I spend a lot of time thinking about them, and we use CWGK as we call the project, to reflect how ordinary people experienced the Civil War. So while this is a talk about early governors, I'm trying to use it more broadly to frame how ordinary Kentuckians are experiencing life. That may seem like an odd thing, and whenever we get grant funding, it usually asks why is our title, we say the project's about ordinary people, but we're talking about, it's titled after governors. But what I want to do is sort of use the governors to highlight some broad changes in Kentucky, from Isaac Shelby all the way up through Thomas Bramlett, the last of the Civil War governors, and a little bit afterwards. But kind of framing some of these broad changes and really breaking down what I see as sort of three periods. You have this period of settlement when Kentucky is more of a frontier. White individuals are moving across the Appalachian Mountains. We're establishing Kentucky as a state. The governors early on as Kentucky is built. Then this transition period, and then of course the Civil War period. So I look forward to kind of running through this. If we have questions at the end, I'm happy to sit down and talk about those. And again, thank you all for being here. So to do that, I want to paint a picture early on. What do governors in 19th century Kentucky look like? And I know we start in 1792, late 18th, early 19th century. What do we see? What is sort of the portrait of these early 19th century governors? Well, first, I think it's important to lay out, right, that many of the early governors, to their chagrin, when they would get into Frankfort, when they would come into power, they would highlight the limited opportunities that they had, the limited political power. The governors are in many ways figureheads. They have some power, but it is fairly constrained. And they end up having more or less three prominent roles. One is appointments. Up until 1850, they're appointing Commonwealth's attorneys across the state, right? Sort of the prosecuting attorneys in each of the state's counties. They're also responsible for appointing militia officers. To the chagrin of many of the governors, Simon Bolivar Buckner, late in the 19th century, will say the great drudgery, the great burden of being a governor is having to deal with all of the petitions. Everyone across the Commonwealth writing to the governor about everything from, I got fined for dealing faro, or fined for drinking alcohol, or insert what other random thing they get fined for, besieged them. They dealt with petitions and remissions, but it was one of the key things that they could do, right? They could intersect or intervene in the daily lives of ordinary people. And most importantly, early on, they are commanding the state militia, right? As Kentucky is formed in 1792, the governors are in charge of the state militia, dealing with a variety of external threats, whether it's competing empires as America is moving westward, Native American groups, Shawnee, Cherokee, Mingo, right, different Native American groups along the Ohio River Valley, or internal concerns about what would happen. If I mention the name James Wilkinson and Aaron Burr, you might think of certain conspiracies to possibly remove Kentucky from the Union and join another empire. We'll talk about that in a minute, but there are a number of threats, right, that Kentucky's early governors, that Kentucky is facing. It should be no surprise to us then that the first 10 governors of Kentucky all have some type of military experience, either serving in colonial militias, most of them in Virginia troops, right, Kentucky comes from Virginia, serving in the Revolutionary War, or fighting Native Americans, or fighting in the War of 1812. If you're Isaac Shelby, you do every single one of these things, because Isaac Shelby does a little bit of everything. But there is going to be a fairly massive shift as the 19th century moves along. Across the 19th century, there are 31 Kentucky governors. Does anybody want to take a guess how many of them are attorneys at the end of the century? I'm encouraging active participation, I know. Does anybody think it's more than 20 or less than 20? What? John, you said more, right? Yeah. It's 21 of the 31 governors in the 19th century, about 68%. I'm a historian, I'm not good at math. I think that's 68% rounded up. I generally have fairly self-deprecating humor throughout most of my talks, so I apologize in advance for that. But yeah, 21 of the 31 governors are connected to the legal profession in some way. And right, I heard someone make a comment, right? It makes sense that as America modernizes and professionalizes, you see an emergence of a professional crop of politicians. Most of them are going to be attorneys. Now again, I want to lay out these three sort of phases that I see. And this first one is very much the threats that Kentucky faces. The early governors are dealing with a number of threats. And we should start with Isaac Shelby. Born in Maryland in December of 1750, Isaac Shelby eventually moves his family to Western Virginia, and then eventually out into what becomes Kentucky. Shelby is well known, right, as I joked before, he does a little bit of everything. But he develops a strong reputation in the Virginia militia. A lot of that comes from Lord Dunmore's War in 1774. As American settlers are moving west, moving across the Appalachian Mountains and pushing into what becomes Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, they meet great resistance from Native American groups out west, or what they would have called the West at the time. During Lord Dunmore's War, Isaac Shelby is a lieutenant in the Virginia militia. At the Battle of Point Pleasant, Shawnee and Mingo Native Americans attack attack the British settlement at the confluence of the Kanawha and Ohio River. Isaac Shelby is in the area. He is part of the force that is gathering at Point Pleasant, and in the battle, he is going to lead a flanking attack that helps drive Chief Cornstalk and the Native Americans that are attacking the British back across the Ohio River. From this operation, Shelby gains an early amount of fame that he is going to carry with him for much of the rest of his life. As he moves west into Kentucky, right, he helps establish Kentucky. He becomes the first governor, but he is defined by the military threats that are imposed upon Kentucky by Native American groups and by the British during the Revolutionary War and through the War of 1812. It might be important to note here to dispel the notion, right, that Kentucky is an empty wasteland, that there is no one living there when Daniel Boone, Shelby, James Garrett, and other early governors move into Kentucky. There are Native American groups, right? For many years, historians were like, well, it was an empty space and people just moved in. Not an entirely accurate assessment, right? There are Native Americans who have used Kentucky as hunting grounds. They've established villages. Some are temporary and seasonal, but Kentucky is a space that is contested. And that contestation defines the Kentucky experience through the American Revolution and into the earliest days of its settlement. James Garrett, the second governor of Kentucky, right? He serves also during the Revolutionary War. He moves into Kentucky. Again, a gentleman who does a little bit of everything, right? He's a grist mill operator. He's a distiller, truly Kentucky profession. I can say this, my wife is a distiller. Garrett also is a judge and a colonel in the Virginia militia. I am going to keep knocking this water bottle over throughout the evening. But Garrett and Shelby, along with others, help establish and defend Kentucky, or I'm saying Kentucky. They would be Virginians at the time, but they are defending what becomes Kentucky from conflict with British and Native Americans. Isaac Shelby himself will go and fight at the Battle of Kings Mountain, pictured here on this slide, laying out, again, these tensions or these external threats to what eventually becomes Kentucky. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there isn't a clean break between the United States and the British, especially in the Old Northwest in the aftermath of the American Revolution. The historian Carrie Ann Yokota would highlight that Americans have economic, cultural, and social ties that remain with Britain until the War of 1812, right? Independently or politically, the United States becomes separate, but Americans have spent almost all of their lives connected in some ways to Britain. We can think of George Washington. He is ordering British British-made furniture during the Revolutionary War, right? Because that's what you do as a gentleman. You order the finest goods from Europe. So while Americans are independent after the Revolution, there are these connections, intellectual, right? People become doctors or professors by going to European institutions. There are cultural ties, there are economic ties still to England. For Kentucky, this feels a little different, right? That's a very Eastern story. It is ports in New York and Philadelphia. But for Kentucky, right, there are British soldiers that are still garrisoned in forts in the Old Northwest. They are arming Native American bands, eventually unified under Tecumseh, right? The Shawnee leader. My brain now. I believe he's Shawnee. The Shawnee leader who will unify Native Americans in the War of 1812. Kentuckians feel these threats. They also deal with internal challenges, right? There's a great deal of uncertainty after Kentucky is formed in 1792, sort of at the back end of the country of where Kentucky will fall. I mentioned James Wilkinson earlier, right? He is a noted spy for the Spanish government who has, along with other landed elites west of the Appalachian Mountains, connections to Spain, and questions about what will happen to Kentucky. Will Kentucky stay in the Union? Will people like Wilkinson deliver Western territory to the Spanish Empire or one of the other empires, right? Again, Britain is still roaming around in forts arming Native Americans. There are these concerns. And then, of course, you have Aaron Burr, the former vice president who, after he leaves office in 1805, begins making his way west, down the Ohio River with a group of men, and reports start coming to Governor Christopher Greenup, another veteran of the Revolutionary War, that Burr means ill towards Kentucky, that he is moving to either capture territory, possibly form his own government. Now, none of these rumors are ever truly substantiated. Burr's arrested on several occasions. He's brought before grand juries in Kentucky and New Orleans, and eventually sent to Washington, D.C., where 140 witnesses are brought before him, because I almost said Jefferson Davis, wrong Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, is convinced that Burr has committed treason. Burr is eventually is not convicted of treason. They cannot prove that he does. But Christopher Greenup is going to deploy the Kentucky militia along the Ohio River to protect the state from this potential interference. I'm trying to paint this picture, right? And again, I realize I'm painting in incredibly broad strokes here. Paint this picture that Kentuckians feel put upon. They feel under threat from Native American groups, from individuals like Burr or Wilkinson. There is considerable consternation about Kentucky or its place in the Union. And this is best seen in the War of 1812. As tensions between Britain and the United States amplify over the seizure of sailors from American ships, British citizens who have revoked their citizenship and are captured and impressed into the British Navy, Kentuckians still see conflict in the Northwest. If you've watched Ken Burns' recent documentary about the American Revolution, right, he places westward expansion as one of the key factors behind the revolution, right? The movement westward is what's driving Americans to fragment and break from the British Empire. But again, if we're thinking that there isn't a clean break and there's still conflict in the Northwest on the high seas between Britain and America, the War of 1812 proves to be this final fragmentary break that truly separates the United States from Great Britain. And for Kentuckians, they are enthusiastic about the prospect of war. As conflict brews, they are pushing and advocating for military conflict. In 1812, when war is finally declared, Isaac Shelby has to turn away volunteers. Yes, Isaac Shelby returns to be governor again, to lead Kentucky troops into battle. And he will lead his men into Ohio and Indiana on attempts to recapture Fort Detroit, or what becomes the city of Detroit. So there is this great enthusiasm from Kentuckians to fight in the War of 1812 to secure that western frontier, right, to secure westward expansion. Kentucky is the birth, or is the child of this westward expansion, so it is natural. And there are a couple of key moments, right, for Kentuckians during the War of 1812. The first one comes in early 1813 at the Battle of River Raisin. On January 18th and 19th, 1813, about 1,000 Kentucky troops are able to capture a tiny settlement along the River Raisin. They secure the River Raisin on the 18th, and on the 19th there is a counterattack. Over 100 Kentuckians will die in that engagement, and another 500 or so will be captured. A fairly damning defeat that sets back that early drive towards Detroit. Over the remainder of the summer, more volunteers will come forward. Shelby will lead men with William Henry Harrison back into Ohio country, into the Northwest. After victories on Lake Erie, Harrison is going to be able to capture Detroit and pursue British troops into Canada. And here is the Battle of the River Thames. At this battle, Kentucky troops, along with Ohio troops, are able to defeat the British. Perhaps more importantly, they kill the Native American leader Tecumseh in the battle. The objective for Kentuckians during the War of 1812, right, is to secure that western frontier. And when I used to teach history classes, right, I used to teach military history at West Virginia University, I would often talk about the War of 1812, and I was dissuaded from putting a reference to Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back up. During this talk, I had a picture of Darth Vader. I was told I shouldn't do that, but I will walk my way through explaining it. I've always referred to the War of 1812 as best a draw for the United States, right? Any war where your capital is captured and burned by the enemy, generally speaking, is not a particularly good war for you. But it is a good conflict for Kentuckians, right? The United States remains independent. Kentucky defeats Tecumseh, who is organizing Native American resistance against Ohio and the western states, and Kentuckians now see themselves, right, as purely the kind of vanguard of the nation, right? Westward expansion can continue unchallenged, and the next 5 governors after Shelby all served in the War of 1812, right? This conflict sort of lays out the credentials for what it means to enlist and serve. And even John J. Crittenden, eventually governor in the 1840s, serves on Shelby's staff and is noted for having served because he knew he couldn't have any career in politics in Kentucky if he didn't serve in that conflict. So the War of 1812, while this is a very glum interpretation of the War of 1812, right? Like, people die, our capital's burned, but we're still independent. And for Kentucky, that western frontier is secured. And this sets up a transition period, or what I would call is an important transition period. And I use some photos from the Kentucky Historical Society's collection. One is a Paul Sawyer painting of the Frankfort Cemetery and Daniel Boone's grave, and the other is the old state capitol, not too far down the street, one of the buildings that KHS currently administers, the third capitol building of the third state house for Kentucky. And I think these images work really well together to highlight this transition period. This is where we get that run of many lawyers being governors. Aside from John Crittenden, after Thomas Metcalf, there are no governors with military experience until, depending on how you look at it, one of the, we'll say Thomas Bramlett, who serves in the Civil War, but there is relatively little need for military experience. Kentucky is settled, it is protected, and the nation is moving westward. More importantly, Kentucky is professionalizing like the nation. This is a trend that takes place across the country. We see the emergence of national political parties that have the means to communicate across broad stretches, right? Kentucky is home to Henry Clay and the emergence of the Whig Party, of national parties that connect Kentuckians and regional concerns together. And I mention Henry Clay because he and his party, right, there's a succession of Whigs in the 1830s and 1840s who run Kentucky, really shape the image of Kentucky as the lead compromiser, right? Clay himself twice rivets the nation together in 1820 and 1850 as questions of expansion and slavery force Americans to reckon with increasingly irreconcilable differences between the North and the South. Perhaps not irreconcilable, but significant differences between the sections of the country. And Kentuckians increasingly come to see themselves as the glue that holds the nation together. They are a border state, right? Juxtaposed in the north by Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, states that do not have slavery. I've now managed to knock the microphone over. I only can suspect the podium is next, so I'm going to just take a step back. But Kentucky itself, a slave state, Virginia, its mother state, and Tennessee, also slave states, right? Kentucky is the boundary between freedom and slavery, or one of the many boundaries between freedom and slavery in the nation. But Kentuckians, because of this history of compromise, of the economic success that the state has, exporting tobacco and hemp, using the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, railroads that emerge, Kentucky comes to see itself as the linchpin that holds the nation together. And this is incredibly important as we come to the eve of the Civil War. And Kentucky feels so secure in 1852, its militia essentially dissolves. There is no real militia structure in the state. There's an attempt to reform it in 1856, but it doesn't really reform until 1859. And that's because of a man by the name of John Brown attacks a federal installation at Harper's Ferry, where he attempts to incite a slave insurrection in Virginia. Brown fails, and I didn't even ask our curators if I could do this, but one of my favorite items at KHS is one of the pikes that John Brown brought. Edmund Ruffin, whose daughter lived in Frankfort, took pikes from John Brown's raid, right? He had taken Bowie knives and turned them into pikes, and Edmund Ruffin sent these pikes to every single slaveholding state across the South and said, this is a taste of what abolitionists have for you if you don't act. And so then Governor Beriah McGoffin, the first of the Civil War governors, when we do this quiz in literally like 12 seconds, you know the answer is at least more than 2. But McGoffin gets the pike. He is inspired, as other southern states are, and he will remobilize the Kentucky State Militia in 1859. He names it the State Guard. He puts eventual Confederate general and post-Civil War governor Simon Bolivar Buckner in charge of the State Guard. Not that he knew any of those things at the time. But that brings us to our quick quiz that I've been building up and probably won't be as exciting as I think. But how many governors, if you had to take a guess, does Kentucky have during the Civil War?
5.
5. Yes, we've got several that are correct. There are 5 Civil War governors for Kentucky during the Civil War. And this is the point where I always mention, right? Not always mentioned, but I have a running joke, right? I came to Kentucky in 2019 before COVID. I had just finished up my Ph.D. I wrote about the Civil War. Obviously, I knew about the Civil War. I had just spent years working on a project about it, and I still am working on a project about it. Eventually, I'll publish the book. But I'm like, I understand the Civil War. And I got to Kentucky, and I was like, none of this makes any sense. Everything is on fire. Why is everything on fire? In large part because there are 5 governors. There are 3 wrapped in blue Union governors. There's Beriah McGoffin, James Fisher Robinson, and Thomas Eliot Bramlett. There are 2 provisional Confederate governors, George W. Johnson and Richard Hawes. It will not shock you when I tell you that all 5 of these men are attorneys, right? 3 of them have some form of military experience during the Civil War, but I think the way I wanted to go about doing this, kind of talking about the Civil War governors, I couldn't avoid, right, doing this talk mostly focusing on the Civil War governors. You brought a Civil War historian in, that should have been expected. What I wanted to do is divide the governors up a little bit into what I see as several themes that help encapsulate how Kentuckians experience the Civil War. One is this period of neutrality. There's also combat, right? There are many Kentuckians, somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 to 140,000 Kentuckians, both white and black, will fight in the Civil War. There is also exile. There are 2 of these governors who will become exiles at different points. 3, okay, sorry, I'm wrong. If you count both Confederate ones, it's 3. But they become exiles forced out of their homes. This reflects many other Kentuckians on the ground who experience exile. And then there's also this embittered, embattled feeling for many of these Kentuckians. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through some of their experiences, lumping a couple of them together to highlight some of these broader trends that I think, or broader themes that better explain how Kentuckians experience the Civil War. And to start with, I have to use my favorite political cartoon about Civil War Kentucky. Published in Harper's Weekly, this political cartoon is very clearly a dig at Beriah McGoffin. And it says, Governor McGoffin's neutrality means holding the cock of the walk, Uncle Sam, while the Confederate cat, Jeff Davis, kills off his chickens. And you can see, right, a wild cat with a bottle of bourbon upon his hip, the clearest indication that this is supposed to be a representation of Kentucky that we can find, holding back a rooster while his chickens, with the word Union, if you can't see it, written upon them, and a cat in a dress with a skull and crossbones upon its chest, attacking those chickens. Kentuckians are deeply divided by the prospect of civil war. After Abraham Lincoln is elected president, Kentuckians divide, and there is no equal way to divide them or neat way for me to show a map and be like, this place was pro. I'm just going to hold it. Pro-union, this part was pro-secession. We can say that the Jackson Purchase, right, is, okay. We can say that the Jackson Purchase is solidly pro-secession, and Eastern Kentucky is very strongly pro-union, but in the middle, right, it's a mess and it's divided. But Kentuckians end up focusing on neutrality, right, because they're unable to agree. Magoffin wants to see Kentucky as the compromiser. He calls for a border state slave convention. He wants Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky, Tennessee, all of these border states to come together to prevent bloodshed and prevent civil war. That never amounts to anything. It fails. When Confederate forces fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor and Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops to defend the Union, Magoffin refuses, right? He says, I refuse to provide Southern soldiers to suppress our fellow Southern slave states. And then Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, is like, oh, cool, you're going to send us guys, right? Exactly the words that he uses. I have not modified those at all. And Brian Magoffin's like, no. We do not want to fight in this. I'm not sending you any troops either. And on May 20th, Magoffin declares neutrality. And in many ways, this is an attempt to buy time. It's an attempt by Unionists and Confederates in the state, or secessionists, I should call them at this point, in the state to buy time, to consolidate political power. And that power consistently shifts into the hands of Unionists with electoral victories in May and August. And they don't trust Magoffin. Magoffin is strongly pro-states' rights. I won't go so far as to say he's a secessionist. I think he's deeply complicated. But Magoffin is very strongly pro-states' rights. Many in the Unionist legislature distrust him. John Marshall Harlan, the eventual Supreme Court justice, sleeps in the old state capitol to prevent a surprise vote on secession by the legislature, right? His wife writes in her memoirs, like, he didn't come home, he just stayed in the Capitol building to save the Union. They don't trust Magoffin. So when neutrality is declared after those elections in May, he is robbed of his power. Robbed is a very strong word. His power to command the state militia is taken away from him. A military board of 5 individuals is created, including Magoffin. And to not confuse anyone, they create the Home Guard in comparison to the pro-secession State Guard. They create a pro-union Home Guard. I still have a note on my computer screen at work that's like, blue, Home Guard equals Union, State Guard equals secession, because I just was like, why would they name them almost the same thing? But Kentucky's neutrality is broken in early September 1861, when Confederate forces capture Columbus on the Mississippi River. In the process of capturing Columbus, some guy by the name of Ulysses S. Grant out of Cairo, Illinois, moves into Paducah. Union troops begin moving into the state, and the Unionist legislature asks the Confederate troops to withdraw. They refuse. There is a convention hosted at Russellville, and George W. Johnson is elected or chosen as the first Confederate governor of Kentucky, setting up in Bowling Green. You now have 2 divided capitals, right? One at Frankfort and one at Bowling Green. And this red line that I've drawn here is a rough approximation of what territory Confederate troops hold early in late 1861 and into early 1862. As you can see, it's not terribly big. It's fairly fragile, and this line will only hold until January of 1862. After the Battle of Mill Springs, if you can see the little laser pointer I have here, this battle over here, Mill Springs, it's now a relatively new National Park Service site. That battle is relatively small, but when Union forces win and secure this spot over the Cumberland River, it forces Confederate troops to abandon the state. And you get this map throughout 1862, right? Ulysses S. Grant captures Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in early February. Nashville, the first capital of the war, falls to Union troops within the next couple of weeks. And by April 6th, 1862, Union forces have used the Tennessee and Cumberland River to push deep into Tennessee, intent on trying to take Corinth. And you can kind of see it from this map, but there are railroads stringing out from Corinth. It is a vital supply center. Confederate forces will counterattack at a place called Pittsburgh Landing, or better known as the Battle of Shiloh. George W. Johnson, the first Confederate governor, will take this opportunity. He has followed the Confederate commander, Albert Sidney Johnson, on his staff to enlist. He is about 51 years old, a little young to be a buck private, but nevertheless he shoulders a rifle and joins the Confederate attacks on Ulysses S. Grant's troops. Unfortunately for George W. Johnson, he is mortally wounded during the battle. He is wounded, taken by Union troops onto a gunboat where he'll pen his last letter to his wife and pass away on April 8th. Johnson dies, and again, this is the Slate George Marshall Harlan show. Harlan shows up and helps recover George W. Johnson's body and ships it back to his native Scott County. I mentioned Johnson here to highlight, right, the extremes that the Kentucky Confederates are going through. They, for most of the war, don't control any part of Kentucky. He briefly holds on to Bowling Green for a couple months. He retreats when Confederate forces leave, enlists, and sees combat. He has no previous military experience, but neither do any of the other individuals. His successor, Richard Hawes, will also serve in the Confederate military briefly, and Thomas Bramlett serves, as I mentioned earlier, in the 3rd Kentucky Volunteer Infantry Regiment. But Johnson highlights, right, this short-lived first attempt at a Kentucky Confederate government. He is replaced by Richard Hawes, and Hawes, I think, spends most of his time, I know, he spends most of his time, aside from about 6 weeks, in exile. He'll spend most of his time in Richmond, Virginia, pleading for money and troops to try and capture Kentucky. This is especially prominent after a failed invasion of Kentucky in the summer of 1862. Brian McGoffin, tired of being besieged by people who distrusted him, will eventually resign from being governor, allowing some political maneuvering, a lawyer also from Scott County, James Fisher Robinson, to replace him. Robinson's in office for a couple days before the state is invaded. Confederate forces under Braxton Bragg and Edmund Kirby Smith will invade in August of 1862, and as you can see by this map, they do a pretty good job of capturing much of central Kentucky. They take Bardstown, they win a battle on August 30th at Richmond, they capture Lexington, Mount Sterling, and Frankfort. This city, the only Union capital captured during the entire Civil War, is captured on September 2nd, and it'll be held for a little bit over a month until October 4th, 1862. This invasion, right, is called the Confederate Heartland Offensive. It pairs fairly well with events going on in the Eastern Theater, Robert E. Lee launching an invasion of Maryland, but it ends about as successfully in that there's a major battle that's a draw and everybody retreats. But more importantly, Richard Hawes, Robinson, right, the Union government is forced to flee to Louisville, and Richard Hawes is brought to Frankfort on October 4th to be installed as the official governor of Kentucky, and I used air quotes there. He shows up, and the only way I can really describe this that makes sense to me is I describe it as it's a movie scene. Hawes shows up. It goes into the old state capitol, well, it wouldn't have been the old state capitol. It goes into the Capitol and the House of Representatives chamber, and he gives this speech. This speech is available at KHS. It's available on the Civil War governor's website. And the gist of the speech is, your legitimate government is here, and we are never leaving. We are here, and we're going to be here forever. Again, he doesn't say those words exactly, but that's the tone, right? You've been robbed. You've been mistreated by the federal government. We're here to protect you. There's a picnic that is supposed to be happening on the front of the lawn to celebrate his inauguration, right? Every inauguration has a picnic. I say this as a movie because Hawes goes, "We will never leave," and the smash cut is to an empty picnic table with napkins blowing by, and Hawes and Bragg in a wagon riding as fast as they can out of town because fighting has begun in the outskirts of Frankfort. If we pop back to this map, I'm just going to let the water bottle go at this point. If we pop back to this map, right, you can see that Union forces are spreading out, and Confederate troops are spread out from Bardstown to Frankfort to Mount Sterling. They are divided, they're outnumbered, and they don't know where the Union troops are. And honestly, within hours of Hawes finishing this inaugural, fighting starts taking place outside of Frankfort. Confederate skirmishers engage Union troops, and they are driven back. And Braxton Bragg and Richard Hawes are like, we got to get out of here. It makes more sense it feels better to me to be like, it's a movie, and they're running, and they're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, we have to get out of here. Bragg and Hawes flee. Hawes will flee into exile. Bragg goes to fight the Battle of Perryville as he consolidates his troops, launches attacks against a portion, about a third of the Union Army, bloodies it pretty significantly, but then realizes he still has to fight 2/3 of the Union Army the next day and goes, I'm out of here. And he will leave, and aside from raids by John Hunt Morgan and a lot of guerrilla activity, Kentucky is, for the most part, not a major battlefield of the war for the remainder of the conflict. Yet there is a fundamental change that is going to take place for Kentuckians in late 1863 and through 1864. And it's Thomas Elliott Bramlett, an attorney from South Central Kentucky. He was born in what is Cumberland County, or the Clinton County part of Cumberland County originally. He moves to Adair County, and he is an attorney, circuit judge before the war. He organizes and commands the 3rd Kentucky Volunteer Infantry Regiment from October 1861 to July 1862. He resigns on July 4th, 1862, in what I can only describe as a symbolic moment of whining. Some of his troops have been assigned to the command of another state's commander, and he's like, hey, I want these guys. I got to stop talking very informally like I'm a 21st century human being. He complains bitterly about the fact that these men have been assigned to another state's commander. He protests, and then eventually resigns. And on his service record, you can see the correspondence between other commanders, and the one guy is like, this is actually nothing. He is complaining about just ordinary military affairs. He's complaining about nothing. Bramlett has a tendency to complain about a lot of things. This is not out of character for him. He is also a federal district attorney appointed by Abraham Lincoln from February of 1863 to May of 1863. And then he becomes the 23rd governor of Kentucky. He has an incredibly cyclical series of small things that he does during the war. But there are two things I want to highlight in this sort of theme about being in battle. One, this is a map of Frankfort in 1864. On June 10th and June 11th, Bramlett will be in Frankfort when about 200 Confederates from John Hunt Morgan's last raid into Kentucky attack this city. There's a small battle here between June 10th and June 11th, 1864. Bramlett, unlike James Fisher Robinson, does not leave the city. He will stay with several hundred, about 120 local militia troops to defend Frankfort. They partially will use Fort Boone up on what today we call Fort Hill and the Kentucky State Arsenal as the main strategic points to defend the city. Bramlett is in Fort Boone on the night of June 10th when that fort is attacked. Confederate troops will drive the Union militia back into the fort before they eventually retreat that evening. They even capture a cannon, but they're not able to wheel it away. The next day, Confederate troops will try to attack from across the river and through what is the Frankfort Cemetery. Again, they are repulsed. It's a relatively small battle. There's about 5 Confederate soldiers that die in the entire engagement. But Thomas Bramlett himself is in the earthworks, defending the city, fighting on the front lines. But more importantly, one of the elements from this story is before the engagement happens on June 10th, there's about 80 African-American laborers, enslaved men who are helping dig the earthworks or dig defenses on Fort Hill. Daniel Weisinger Lindsay, the adjutant general, sends those men away. He's a little afraid of things that happened at Fort Pillow not more than a couple of weeks earlier, where United States colored troops are murdered by Confederate soldiers at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. While these men are not soldiers, they are laborers. Kentucky is exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. None of these men are free. Slavery still exists in June of 1864 in Kentucky, technically. They're afraid that these men will be seen as soldiers and that the white officers in the fort might be executed. 2 of those men are Leander Pickens and Adam Duval, 2 men enslaved and owned by Thomas Bramlett. And a few months later, in September of 1864, both of those men are going to leave Frankfort, and they're going to go to Camp Nelson in Jessamine County, Kentucky. And there, they enlist in the United States colored troops, the 5th United States Colored Cavalry. They are 2 of 10,000 men that enlist at Camp Nelson that fight for the Union Army, the United States Army, African-American men formerly enslaved who enlist at Camp Nelson. And this is the thing that embitters and embattles Kentuckians. Bramlett himself is furious that his 2 enslaved men have run away. He is furious throughout all of 1864 that the institution of slavery is being destroyed by the federal government. Kentuckians have gone to war, right, in many ways to preserve the Union as it was in 1860. That means a Union unchanged and slavery intact. And Bramlett sees the continuous enrollment of African-American troops as a violation, as a fundamental wrong that is put upon Kentuckians by the federal government. He's already passed the crisis point at the battle in June 1864 and in September when Leander and Adam run away. In March of 1864, Bramlett calls a meeting. This is as African-American enrollment begins. It's about in February. And through February and March, African-American enrollment begins picking up. So not too far from down here at what was the Capitol Hotel, I think the building burns down, it's a bank now. Bramlett calls a meeting. He invites Stephen Burbridge, eventually the commander of the District of Kentucky, Robert J. Breckinridge, a strong Unionist, Richard Bell, a physician from Louisville, and for some reason, Albert Gallatin Hodges. He's the publisher of the Frankfort Commonwealth. He's a newspaper editor, but he doesn't fit the vibe that everybody else has a B last name, and then there's just Albert Gallatin Hodges. Bramlett has a 6 or 8 hour meeting that night that lasts well into the morning to discuss what Kentucky should do about the enrollment of African American troops. And in the morning, a proclamation is published that encourages Kentuckians to refrain from violent resistance against the enlistment of black troops. Trust to the legal process, it says. Except that's not what Bramlett argues the night before. I found a letter at the University of Kentucky that Bramlett writes to his lieutenant governor, Richard Jacob. And the letter is about 8 pages long, and it opens with a sentence that's neither Northerners or Southerners can understand the Kentucky mind, which seems like an apt statement, right? Southerners call us abolitionists because we fight for the North. Northerners call us copperheads or traitors because we fight with the South. And in this letter, Bramlett goes on to ask Jacob, basically he's saying, I want us to be on the same page. I want us to understand when I go to this meeting tonight where we are. And there's one paragraph that has always stuck out to me. And to summarize it, he more or less says, to make sure, if the federal government is willing to make issue over Kentucky laws and violate Kentucky laws, I will call back the Union soldiers and the prodigal. He's referring to the prodigal sons. He's referring to Confederates, and have them fight with us under the starlit banner of our fathers. Bramlett is willing to fight the federal government over the enrollment of African American troops in March of 1864. Stephen Burbridge, Robert Breckinridge talk him off a ledge in this meeting for 8 hours, presumably why it's 8 hours. They're telling him, this is crazy. You can't launch another rebellion in the middle of a civil war. The federal government will come in and beat the stuffing out of us. I assume they said words something like that. And Bramlett and Robert Breckinridge will fight about this in the years after the war. He's like, I never said anything like, there's newspaper exchanges back and forth. But I think this shows, right, how Kentuckians feel. And historians like Ann Marshall and Patrick Lewis and Aaron Astor have highlighted the change for Kentuckians. The E. Merton Coulter quip that Kentucky waited until after the Civil War to secede is a little inaccurate. Many Kentuckians are pro-Union, but they grow embittered by the actions of the federal government during the Civil War. They come to hate the fact that African-American troops enlist. 24,000 African-American men will fight from Kentucky. Only Louisiana provides more soldiers for the United States Army during the Civil War. Kentucky provides the second most. Camp Nelson is the third largest recruitment center for your African-American troops in the conflict. And Kentuckians come to resist this, right? And I realize I've spent more time, I got carried away. There's a great deal of resistance to African-American freedom and liberty post-war. Bramlett is a proponent of this. After he leaves office, challenges the 14th and 15th Amendments. He is resistive to those. And Kentuckians themselves, right, reject the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. In 4 days, it'll be the 50th anniversary of when the state of Kentucky actually ratified the 3 Reconstruction Amendments that ended slavery, guaranteed citizenship, and voting rights to African Americans. It took until 1976. After the war, very briefly, if you were not either pro-Confederacy, pro-secession, or at least extremely anti-Union, or 3 former Confederate soldiers, James B. McCreary, Luke P. Blackburn, or Simon Bolivar Buckner, you could not be elected to being governor in Kentucky. There is this shift in a messy memory of Kentucky's Civil War experience. That sort of brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about. Again, I realize I got carried away there. It's what happens when you let a historian with a mic that keeps falling over keep talking. To reiterate, though, I think we can see from the governors sort of these big trends in Kentucky's experience. Early on, they are used to defend the Commonwealth from internal and external threats. They become the linchpin, right, for this transition period as Kentucky matures, as the nation matures. And then they are deeply involved in the Civil War and setting up the memories that come and linger for Kentucky for many years afterwards. That is a rushed conclusion over the last 3 slides, but I appreciate all of you listening, and I'm happy if the microphone will stay up to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
If you have a question, I'm going to bring you the mic so they can hear you for TV. Hold on one moment. There you go.
Since Jefferson Davis was from Kentucky, did he have any influence on the 5 governors?
As far as I'm aware, no. The governors are selected by a council of, I think it's like a council of 11. There's a few, so there's a convention in Russellville that is held in November of 1861 after secession occurred, after Kentucky ends its neutrality. So as far as I'm aware, it's local Kentuckians. There's about 116 representatives from 68 states, at least with Johnson, and then Hawes is brought in after that. But I do not believe Jefferson Davis has too much influence. It's a good question, though. Thank you.
One moment.
We should play the Jeopardy.
You're next.
Chuck, are any of the Civil War and pre-Civil War Kentucky governors, are any of them not slaveholders, or do any of them express any abolitionist or anti-slavery sentiments at any point?
I remember as I was going through my notes for this, I think it's James Garrett, so we're going really far back, that has some animosity towards the institution of slavery. All 5 of the Civil War governors do own enslaved individuals. Bramlett in 1860 has about 12. I don't know the specifics for the other ones off the top of my head, but yes, all of them are enslavers. I think most of them in the 1850s are. By the time of the Civil War, right, Kentuckians accept slavery as an institution, and politically, at least in the 1850s, there are not any that are openly, right? We can think of people like John Fee or Calvin Fairbank who are chased out of Kentucky or targeted. It would have been political suicide to express any reservations by the 1850s about the institution of slavery. Earlier, you might see a bit more resistance to it. I think there's a couple. Oh. Yeah.
Did any of the Kentucky governors have any connections to the Mexican War?
That's a good question, and I was actually surprised about that I didn't find any connections to the military service. At least, trying to think if the post-Civil War ones do, but the ones in the 1850s do not, that I was able to find.
The federal government does come and offer to pay for slaves. I think it's $850 per slave. I've never seen, what's the official governor's position on this?
Ooh, that's a good complicated question. So compensation is something that is proposed, and Lincoln proposes this on several occasions to border state unionists. And he says, hey, I will compensate you for enslaved individuals There's a historian, Amanda Kleintop out of Elon University, who had a book came out recently that talks about compensation, and almost none of those compensation claims go through. Bramlett, I think, rejects that in the beginning, but when we come to the the 13th Amendment, Bramlett has a speech in December of 1865, or I shouldn't say a speech, his address to the General Assembly. He actually encourages the General Assembly to approve ratification of the 13th Amendment, which from everything I just told you may sound crazy, but I think it's a fairly calculated move. I think Bramlett sees the need to, or what he would say is to get federal interference out of Kentucky. If we pass the 13th Amendment, slavery's dead. The war has decided the institution of slavery is dead. Nothing will fix this. If we ratify the amendment, we'll at least get the federal government to leave us alone. It also doesn't stop Bramlett from submitting 2 claims for Adam and Leander, Adam Duvall and Leander Pickens post-war, but again, he doesn't receive any compensation for those.
How influential were policies and practices of Stephen Burbridge in causing Kentucky to, in effect, secede after the war?
Yeah, Burbridge is fighting a war that he sees the only way that he can control Kentucky is to take harsher measures. But I think you're leading towards a good point that Burbridge's actions, a fairly punitive war, does, or he is, right, fighting the hard war that the federal government leans into in 1863 and 1864 and 65. And I do think that does lead towards Kentuckians, right? There's the example where they take the 4 prisoners outside, out from the penitentiary, take them across the river, and I don't remember the names of those gentlemen, but they're executed for a death up in Peaks Mill, right? A Unionist that is killed. Brad Asher has written a book, right, about the most hated man in Kentucky, that Burbridge wields a heavy hand, and in the complicated nature that is Thomas Bramlett, he's the one who pushes for Burbridge to become the commander of the District of Kentucky, and then he at the end of 1864 is like, oh my God, we have to get this man out of the state, he's ruining everything. I think Burbridge would defend himself by saying, I don't trust Kentuckians, they're too loyal to the institution of slavery, not loyal enough to the Union, and he is taking those hard measures to keep Kentucky in the state. That's a long answer to say, I think he is fairly influential in angering many Kentuckians, and it runs parallel to African American enlistment.
Chuck, going back in the timeline of governors, if you had to decide a governor, I'm thinking of, you have the old guard, like the beginning of the state, right? That frontier, creating a safe state after War of 1812. And then you have this antebellum era leading up to the Civil War. If you had to choose a governor that I would say is like, what administration flips from being old Virginians and Marylanders, to Kentuckians, which governor would you choose? Where does that kind of flip happen? Sorry for the complicated question.
No. I remember making the note somewhere of this is the first governor that's born in Kentucky, and that name is not in my brain currently, but it's the late 18-teens, early 1820s where you start to see that transition. You start to see more Kentuckians who are becoming governors, and solidly by the 1830s, it's all individuals that were Kentuckians. That's not a great answer. Thank you, John. I'm only annoyed at myself because I can see where in my notes I wrote that, and it's just it didn't translate into the brain. But that is a good question. There is that shift eventually.
I always find it interesting, since Burbridge came up, that we devilify him, whatever you want to say, in Kentucky. But what Burbridge is doing in Kentucky is no different than the Confederates are doing in North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and elsewhere. We seem to forget that it's a double-edged sword. The Confederates are doing the same thing against the Union people, and they're doing it here, but for some reason, that whole part of the story is lost in Kentucky's mind, and I just find it, as you say, we joined the Confederacy, but we forget all the things the Confederacy did.
I think that's a really good point about the. Hold on one second. Can you hear me?
There's the button at the bottom.
Oh,
There you go.
okay. I must have hit the button inadvertently. I think that is a very good point, right? That the war, Kentuckians remember the Civil War with a very colored, with a very specific lens, right? And it is this very embittered lens post-war. And it's not just about the destruction of slavery. That is a huge part of it. But Bramlett is a really good example, right? He goes into the war as an ardent unionist. He is giving speeches in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's election saying, secession, this is not the way to go. I'm pro-union, we should stick with the union, right? This is what grants us our liberties. This is where everything came from. By the end of the war, right, Bramlett is pardoning former Confederates. He's welcoming them back after the war has ended into political power. He is frustrated at the federal government, right? He sends a telegram at one point to a provost marshal. He's like, if President Lincoln doesn't stop the enrollment of black men, I will. That's the telegram. That's it, right? And he's sending testy letters. But it's Kentuckians are so frustrated that they are blinded to what is happening locally to them. And I think in many ways the way, aside from Emer and Coulter, right, there has not been a synthetic history of the Civil War in Kentucky since 1926. Looking at the antebellum, wartime, and post-war experiences. There have been many great historians who have talked about slices of Kentucky's Civil War, pre-war or post-war experience, but there isn't that one monograph, and I think it's because it's a messy period, and what that has left is that has left people with this disconnect that Kentucky's experience was purely unique, and there was nothing that overlapped with the attacks on Unionists in Alabama or North Carolina, or the fact that other Union commanders are doing this in Virginia, or they're doing it in other places, right? The war is a brutally hard war that is fought to destroy the institution of slavery as the war goes on, and the Union government takes steps, or the federal government takes steps, and the Confederate government too, right? When Civil War happens, right, loyalty isn't something that can be fudgeable, right? It is something that becomes hard and absolute. Before the Civil War, Americans could hold a multitude of loyalties, and they could be very flexible in those. When Civil War comes about, those become ironclad and extreme. And so I think there is this warping of perception, and it's not just a Kentucky thing, it happens in other places. Brad Asher's book is fantastic on Burbridge. It really highlights a more complex character than just this evil villain that everyone tends to characterize him as. Thank you for that.
Any other questions? Oh, all right, hold on just a second, I'll bring in the mic.
In the War of 1812, do you have a specific person that might have been responsible for killing?
Tecumseh?
Yeah.
I don't know off the top of my head. I know there are a number of individuals who claim to have had that honor or privilege, or choose whatever. Shouldn't say honor or privilege when I'm being recorded, right? But who claim that. But I don't know off the top of my head. I could look into it and try and figure it out for you. But off the top of my head, I do not know. Yeah.
Okay, anyone else? All right, well, let's give Dr. Welsko another round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For being here and sharing with us today. Thank you again to my co-organizer, Jon. We're sorry he couldn't be here today. And the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition, our partner on this series. I just want to remind you really fast, our next lecture will be Saturday, April 11th at 1 p.m. with Charles Bogart, who happens to be right there. Wave your hand, Charles. He will be discussing commerce on the Kentucky River. So we hope that you will come back and join us then. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.